All right, here we are. Last check real quick. You can hear me and see me, right? Because I can hear you and see you.
Hello, hello. We're live.
Awesome. Welcome back, everybody, to What the Future. Last week, we had an awesome conversation in regards to, what did we talk about, Sam, last week? Because it kind of leads into this topic.
Speech and communication.
That's right.
Privacy.
Speech, privacy tech, communication. This week, talking more or less about evolution. So what the evolution? With, I think, a focus on, what evolution for humanity will look like going into the near future and distant future. But more in particular, interplanetary living, bioengineering, transhumanism. This can go a lot of different ways, but humanity has evolved quite a bit over, the thousands of years that we've been on Earth. But throwing us out into the vast reaches and existences of space, and over time, what impact will that have on us? What impact will technological advancements have on us as well? I think that's going to be something very exciting for us to dive into today. Let's see, how should we kick this off? Should we talk about, I guess, the idea a little bit about transhumanism, a little bit, bioengineering, kind of what that encapsulates?
Yeah, I think, I won't go on a 5-minute long journey of human history and human evolution or theories on that this time around. I learned from last week. I was thinking maybe if we could show like a link or definition of, I suppose transhumanism would be a good place to start. If I had my glass whiteboards behind me, I'd just start drawing on them for everyone. But we had some feedback of like people are really excited to learn about these terms and these words, but don't actually know the definition for some of us that are like really deep into this techie stuff. So transhumanism, I don't know, Brandon, if you have a definition, or I can just read from sciencedirect.com. It's the position that human beings should be permitted to use technology to modify and enhance human cognition. So the mind, the way that the mind and brain and thinking works, and bodily function. So of course, the way that the body works. So the debate that we're having now, and this is a huge point of discussion in the futurism or technology space at large, is really these bigger questions about, what are the possibilities of enhancement of the mind, the body, and beyond? What are the ethical debates about that? And, for me, when I was doing some of the research on the topics that we proposed for this week, a lot of debates actually came up that were really relevant today. So I think what's interesting for me about futurism, and sometimes I joke saying they're like futurists or just conspiracy theorists of the future and historians being this of the past, but it really allows us to frame concepts that could be completely out there, right? They seem like science fiction, and maybe they'll come to fruition in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years. But the debates that we're having today around topics that might not seem related just yet can pertain to this.
Absolutely. And it's not so crazy to think about anymore. A lot of this stuff, again, is stemmed from science fiction and creative novels, and thinking about what the distant future could look like, combining human and technology, just natural progression of evolution as well, biopharmaceuticals and stem cells, like different ways to augment the body, turn them, human being into almost like a cyborg in a sense. A lot of that stuff isn't science fiction anymore. Neuralink is a perfect example. We touched on it last week as well. Augmenting the brain slightly to perform different kinds of tasks, whether it's controlling a a mouse on a computer, or playing a video game, or potentially maybe being able to send data back and forth and communicate with other humans, to robotic, limbs for maybe an amputee, or maybe being able to put a chip in your cerebellum so that, someone that's paralyzed might be able to actually be mobile again and be able to walk, to stem cells and being able to maybe grow superior organs, to, there's a million different things. It could be, again, pharmaceuticals, taking a pill like in Limitless, and maybe you unlock a percentage more of your brain or biological function to perform at a higher level. You see this in athletics too, as well, always trying to create like this superhuman athlete or more superior in athletics type of individual. It's a constant pursuit, I think, across sciences, across different niches and different industry. And, it's something that isn't, again, science fiction anymore. It's more and more becoming a reality, and something that's also becoming, I think, more of a necessity too, as we look at things like, what could happen to the future of Earth and our society, and overpopulation and pollution, environmental factors, if we want to live on another planet or in space. Some of these things might be very handy for us to either evolve into or apply to ourselves. So it's quite cool, actually, to see, the singularity starting to merge with humans a little bit, and some of these things actually coming to fruition. But that's essentially what transhumanism is. And you can look at it in different lines of light, but it's an augmentation of the body, of the mind, and for different pursuits too. It doesn't have to be, for a medical reason, or a sporting reason, or a scholastic reason, or a adventuring reason. It can be for many, many different things.
I'm looking for something. I'm going to send it to you. I don't know if you're able to, or if I like screen share this. Maybe.
Yeah, send it. I can pull it up.
I'll send it on your. So on the topic of transhumanism, some of my background, I've built a number of companies in the technology space, and then moved out of that to educate and, come from more of like the commentary side. And for about a decade, I've been giving speeches on stages all around the world. Maybe we don't want to fully show this thing I just shared you because it has the name of the organization on it. But there was an organization I was involved with in the past. And this was very early on in my career, I'd say futurism career. And I was a bit naive. Like, I didn't kind of know so much about what my voice was being used to support or not support. Again, I was quite young, and started asking questions like, what do I stand for? What is the future we want to build? And it was actually the only speech that I've ever been protested. Not me personally, but the entire event. So there were like hundreds of people. We were in Italy protesting us. And there was like the Italian police and the Italian version of the National Guard. And it was quite scary. They were trying to attack us. And I was like, what do I do as a job? It was the first time in my life. And the reason they were protesting was transhumanism. And so I just sent you a pamphlet, or I can share it later in edited version without the organization that was kind of went into, define it. With these babies on it and being like, you're baby killers. And, this was, again, about a decade ago, long before I had even started thinking about these topics. So yeah, I suppose you can kind of see some of the debate here, mainly in the details in this picture of this kind of engineered future human. We can now engineer the human race. So quite a scary thing. And it brought up for me a lot, to the point that I actually stopped doing what I did as a job and kind of disappeared for a bit, because for me, it was a very like ethical set of questions of obviously I can't just blindly advocate for a future that I don't fully understand. None of us do. And, I'm reminded of the novel by Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, which was in the 1800s. So 1818, I sent a link to that. But anyone many people who are listening to this understand the story of Frankenstein, which was written around the time of the invention of electricity. And I was recently going down a rabbit hole on the fear around electricity. So, at the time it was seen as something almost godlike, right? There was not a lot of scientific understanding around it and how it worked, other than it did things or lit up rooms. But also there was around the time like people were electrocuted and then invented terrible things like the electric chair and used that as propaganda to make people almost in a decelerationist technology fear way of like, electricity is bad. It's terrible for the future. It kills people. And, I just had this moment again, thinking about that, like at that time in any moment of history where there's a convergence of new topics, new paradigms, new ideas, new technologies. And we find ourselves at that moment again, but with these very fundamental existential questions of what does it mean to be a human, right? And what is the human species? Does, augmenting that both genetically or cognitively with artificial intelligence and beyond change that? Does it create or classify you as another species essentially? And these are topics that have been kind of marginalized and not really they've like kind of been pushed to the side of human discourse for a little bit, because it's not been, I suppose, politically correct to discuss this. And yet here we go again with now these like really big questions beyond just, I don't know, like gender or biological sex versus like, are you half robot or not? And it's very interesting to see where we are right now in the present, in the tension and fear surrounding the perceptions of what it means to be a human. And then there's like these two camps of people, or many more, that are either like full on ahead, like let's augment the body and push it as far as we can go and make death optional. So they believe, or the reversion to a traditional humanistic mindset that has quite an aversion to this. So I think we're really at this unique crossroads. It's because of the existential nature of it, I think it's quite divisive. I know I felt it when this protest happened. It was like shocking to me and made me question a lot about all of the things that we'll discuss tonight, and not from a way that I have any particular stance. I don't really have strong stances on many things that I explore from a future perspective. I don't think that would be very fair. We're not there yet, but certainly there are questions that came up for me here that we can get into later as we go through this.
Yeah, I think it was Einstein that said, science is more a pursuit of finding ways to ask better questions than it is to just find an answer for something. Because in reality, things are much more complex than they always seem to be. And one day, our concept of one thing will probably be wrong, replaced by another concept. Happens all the time. So I think, it's definitely good not to have too much of a preconceived notion with some of these things, because we really don't know. But it's interesting because we live in a point in time where I think people are very comfortable with exploring different potentialities. Like we talk about, like gender, for example. It's been a very binary conversation for a long time. And regardless of what people believe, people want to challenge that notion. I think that's fine to challenge the notion. I think that's one example of a way we're doing that from a social perspective today. But that, can be applied in many different aspects as well. Like transhumanism too, are we at a point in time where maybe we've hit a biological limit on the body as well? That's another conversation that a lot of people are starting to have. And you're seeing a lot of people look for ways to augment the body, to find ways to kind of go beyond that, whether it's, right or wrong or necessary or not. As well as the mind. The mind's also been a very interesting topic for people wanting to be smarter than they already are, or wanting to have a larger capacity for knowledge or processing power. Like a lot of people believe we only access a portion of our brain. That's always up for debate too. But, there's a huge group of people out there that believe that the right combination of drugs and vitamins and minerals and and certain experimental things might actually enhance that, whether that's true or not. But again, we live in a point in time where these things, whether it's biological, mental, social, are all kind of being, I think, explored right now. And it's very interesting because I think it stems from people, and I think just society in general, feeling a little bit like we're starting to hit a limit on human evolution, and maybe it's time for us to invent the next step. And it just, to me, that's kind of what it feels like when I look around and I see all these different explorations in society. And that's kind of how I look at it, is like different explorations of our mind, explorations of the body, exploration of the universe, exploration of our general evolution, way of thinking, way of treating each other, way of looking at life. So it's definitely an expansive topic.
I agree with you in that I'm seeing what I would call the range of social and biological experiments taking place now, which do bring forth necessary conversation in public discourse. I think the difference now, though, is that there is the autonomy and freedom and access to do this willingly. If we're going back in history, or let's say a commonly conceived narrative of history, the one that we might tell, right? Of like, were we even Homo sapiens yet? Is that what changed us to Homo sapiens, was harnessing fire? Like, right? Was it 2 million years ago? It was in this narrative, right? Mm-hmm. There are different narratives or belief systems around this, but one commonly held belief is that, human beings, not just discovering fire, but harnessing it, actually allowed our jaw, our mandible, to evolve differently because we began cooking food and eating meat and cooked meat, and therefore chewing it differently. And there are a number of different examples of this in history with both humans and animals and so on, right? It's kind of the concept of evolution in general, but that's a technology. That was a technology that we harnessed that had this impact on us. And as we are in modernity, I guess, again, this blanket term for where we are now, like Western modernity, we can talk about things like even the built environment, or where I'm sitting here with these like synthetic fluorescent lights on me, or the food that I'm eating that is disconnected from the source that it's grown. We have mentioned on our to-do list is GMOs, or synthetic foods, both in terms of what we might need to sustain us in an interplanetary species type situation, but also if we're here now living like that, has that impacted us in such a way that those technologies could influence how we evolve? Same thing with our use of, outsourcing our cognition with this technology and soon to be artificial intelligence, which it's on here, right? Like people, I walked by an Apple store the other day, and I guess the new iPhone came out. I don't know. I'm so oblivious to what's happening in the real world. Sometimes I'm like, what's that line? And, that one will have as many of the devices, have an embedded intelligence, which they're calling Apple intelligence, to the point that most of what we're using now, we're not even aware. If you Google something and Gemini is returning the AI augmented search results from their knowledge graph. And again, as these tools become closer to in or on the body, that's the question for me, is how is that changing our mind? And has it already led to some sort of evolutionary split between people who are more connected or less connected, or people who are leveraging the technology in better ways than others, as a, to like advance themselves, as opposed to get addicted to scrolling and dopamine hits. So there are a number of questions here of, I think what makes the topic so contentious is that there's actually this like very libertarian free will aspect of it, of like, I'm just going to do what I want and change, like inject myself with a bunch of stuff and run faster. Or I'm going to take hormones that are not, I'm not going to do this, but like I'm just like listening like people and change their presentation of their gender. And this is obviously like such a heated debate. But what I see from a futurist lens, from a macro lens, is actually just, if you boil it down, it's people augmenting their physical body, like their biological form, with some sort of method, whether it's like a chemical intervention, a technological intervention, a behavioral intervention, which is changing how they present themselves in society. And potentially, I don't know if that would cause an evolutionary split, but science would say no. But, it's definitely, we're seeing a lot of experiments across the board here. And maybe it's a path of sort of a predictive programming in society, of just like people becoming more comfortable with the notion of these augmentations. Again, not suggesting that's like a placing a value judgment towards it, that it's a good or bad thing. I simply see, I think we both see what we see. So I see that that's happening. I have an opinion that it's part of a larger trend that likely will continue and likely will involve some of these topics. So, if we come back here in 5 years, this debate will no longer be a debate on some future woo-woo show, about what's going to happen in science fiction. It'll be like policy debates in an election.
It won't be woo-woo, it'll be woo-hoo, because they'll be like, oh, they were right.
No, it'll be like our AI president will be like, shut up, and it's already done. But yeah, I think a lot of this stuff is, it seems like science fiction. It seems so far off. It seems like something happening 10, 20 years from now. And we're like very well in the midst of it, these debates.
Let me ask you a question. When was the last time that you had to do math and you sat down with a pen and a piece of paper and you did basic math? Add, subtract, multiply, supply. It could have been for the grocery store, doing bills, anything.
I do it in my head to make sure that I have not lost my mind, but not a long time. Someone actually recommended, I found some book on their GitHub the other night, and it was a book written by a mathematician, and he had whole theories of the universe written in math. And I was like, I don't understand. It was like some deep physics. Not my language, but no, like jokes aside, in my non-nerdy self, some basic math, sure. I think on a day-to-day basis, I try to do things without the assistance of this. I don't like use maps either, but if it was anything more advanced, like, yeah, it's like a spreadsheet.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people probably don't anymore. I mean, I try to as often as I can. Like I have a physical notebook and a physical notepad, and I'm writing all the time because I don't want to lose it. But for most people, it's way easier to just ask Siri or ask Gemini or whatever AI version you have on your phone or your computer. What is 15 times 4 than it is to sit down and actually do the multiplication. And it's a very small example, but you mentioned earlier a good term, and outsourcing of information, outsourcing of technology through technology, really is kind of what society is like today. We have a lot of skills. Like we got through the last couple 100 years without computers and technology and the internet, even electricity, which is kind of crazy to think about, like how people used to navigate the world and use star charts. And, some of these things are just completely irrelevant these days because we have GPS and satellites. We have internet. You don't have to worry about, being able to heat your food because you have steady electricity. Or stable internet, being able to access information, or at least stable internet most of the time. Some of us, mine goes out every once in a while too. But we have this ability to outsource so much already. And I don't think that's going to stop. AI, I don't think it's going to stop there either. Get to the point where if someone really wanted to every single day, they could outsource everything they do to the point where they could just sit on the couch. Even most of their work, like I feel like those tools are starting to exist. And a lot of them are very, I think, rudimentary in terms of being able to be focused on efficiencies and making certain tasks easier. But at some point, that's a different way that we could evolve where we don't have to do a lot of those things anymore. We already don't.
Yeah, I when you're talking, I was just sending you a picture. I sometimes show this on stage of my favorite anthropologist, the Disney Pixar movie WALL-E, our little robot friend who comes back to Earth and sees human beings that have outsourced everything. They're just, it's down here. The picture was on this article. They're like sitting on their chairs, consuming content and like drinking out of these giant, like Coca-Cola Soylent hybrids.
That was the funniest part of the movie.
It is. I mean, I show this section because we have to keep it whimsical. It's quite scary when, I was walking down the street the other day. This is in New York City. And of course, I'm always observing people. It's part of my job is just to have this sort of disposition of being a participant observer in life and being part of it. And I don't know if it's like the past couple months or what's going on, but it's like worse than it's been before with people just walking like this straight up with their phone in their face, but which has always been the case, but then like playing the sounds out loud. And I'm like happy that they're not wearing the AirPods, but at the same time, like what is going on? And it almost like to me, again, good or bad thing. Like I happen to be of sort of like a different way of living my life, which is like not as connected. That doesn't mean that I don't leverage technology or didn't help build it or understand deeply how it works. But it almost shows me like the interface it's ready for a new one. If people are so ready and they're doing this, they are ready for the more immersive or augmented realities, and those products will come out and these people will use them. And, the question there is, to your point, if we're like outsourcing all this information or if people don't need to do math. I had this debate on stage with a legal professor who basically took the position that like he has teenage kids. And I had read some research that kids of this age were not able to spell, like their vocabulary was not as strong as the vocabulary of, let's say, an age group demographic of our own. And the implication was that autocomplete was negatively impacting people's ability to spell or to use proper grammar or form sentences or like expand their vocabulary. And this person's argument against mine, it wasn't really for or against. I think you'll get to know that I just like to debate for fun. It doesn't mean that I really have a strongly held belief. On this one, I as a linguist, as someone who values language and thinks that it will be important and powerful as it is now in the future, because it's what shapes or designs the algorithms and the languages that power this reality. But his take was, I don't care if my kids can spell. I don't care if my kids can do math or not. If they know how to use the devices that can help them answer it, why would they need to learn it? I said, my belief was you should know how it works, so that you don't blindly trust something without, if I say, hey, Siri, what is 2 + 2? And Siri's like 8. And I'm like, okay, cool. Are we risking something there if there are not people in society who understand the fundamental building blocks? Or do we evolve past needing to know them and then form new building blocks that transcend things as basic as language or math? And that like is so provocative, right? Math is the language of the universe, apparently, to mathematicians and physicists. To me, I'm like, maybe in a post-quantum world, maybe there's some more, there are other ways to describe the principles, both through math, and maybe some other things. I don't really know what it would be. But this was one of these debates where there's people that are like, I don't care. We're evolving past it and becoming a new kind of human, a superhuman that's augmented by the devices. And then there are others that say we should learn the basic principles of what I'd say is critical thinking or discernment or creativity, and understand how systems work before you blindly rely on them. But, that's just me.
We did an episode a while back, and I remember bringing up, I think it was on longevity. If we were able to live to be 250 years old, something like that, You already see brain deterioration start, when you get into your 70s and 80s, sometimes earlier. It really depends on environmental factor and genetic predisposition to certain things, but it sets in. It's a real biological phenomenon, and we don't know, if you live to 250, if that'll just not happen, as well as what our mental capacity is. So if, we're living a long time, what's the point in remembering what 4 + 4 is? There's an argument to be made there, but for more advanced things, like being able to diagnose a disease or a condition that someone might have, might be more important for us to retain than probably very basic math. Just because I don't think that we have the capacity to handle much larger and more important topics if we were to live a long time. And I think longevity will go up eventually. If we have technology that can replace, the basics, I don't think they're necessary for us to really have to comprehend. I don't know. The mind is a very interesting place to go to, because I don't know how flexible it really truly is. Some people argue that there's a limit on it. Some people argue that it's just a matter of how much processing power you can give it. So I don't have a firm answer on that, but I do think that with technology, why should we waste our time if we want to evolve as a human race, right? Just taking a completely different stance on it. There's an argument to be made. Why do we need to remember certain basic things, like how to do basic algebra or basic construction, or, things that, we could outsource so that we could evolve forward and focus on more heavier mental processing tasks. Because we have technology now, like Google MedPalm, for example. I actually want to pull this up because Google has an AI that's exclusively focused on the medical industry and being able to, and eventually might even replace them at some point too, with things like diagnoses. And if we were to say, lose that knowledge in the sake of pursuing 4 + 4, I think we open ourselves up to be a little bit more vulnerable than if we were to forego 4 + 4, if that makes sense. Because I think we're getting to a point where we have to kind of choose, right? We have technology that can help us with these aspects. Like, how much do we want to rely and trust technology on that so that we can evolve and move forward, versus what do we want to hold on to? And then what capacity do we have to do it all? I think the human has severe limits. And I think the more technology progresses, it just kind of highlights that. Like, it wasn't, that long ago that we built a computer that actually beat the smartest grandmaster in chess in the world. Now it's to the point where it'll beat the grandmaster every single time, no matter how many games they play. We do have a limit on our mental capacity, and I think technology will outpace us unless we can find a way to maybe keep up with it. So I'm kind of lean towards the thinking of maybe we need to find ways to mentally move forward as well to keep up with all this stuff. What do you think?
So, in this debate, for people who are not in the technology industry, I think the words that are used, they're quite inflated at the moment to describe the two different mindsets about the future have emerged, and they've been around for quite some time. And I actually use this word in a different way quite a bit in the way that I describe the era that we're in. Is basically acceleration. So the feeling that everything that is coming together at this moment is making us move faster than ever before, but also the idea to deal with that is that we need to accelerate and move faster through it, like sort of like the what is it? What velocity? Just like we've got to cut through. And then there's sort of the negative. It's almost shared as an insult to describe a group of people. They'd be called decelerationist, so a group of people who are reluctant. I wouldn't say conservative, that's not the right word, but more like reluctant about technological progress. And it's used as an insult. So I'll preface this by saying, ultimately, I think for the survival of humanity and very world order, I don't really think there's a choice, but to progress forward and with haste. However, my questions are, if we're doing that, who gets to decide what information is important to us anymore or not? Like what gets erased from human history? Who's deciding that 2 + 2 doesn't matter, but this group can know about 2 + 2, but that group can't know about 2 + 2? I think that we're getting into a territory here that is, like an ethical gray area, or one where I wouldn't really tend to trust like centralized authorities or companies or governments to be the single like managing body of who controls what we clear off of our societal database. That we're like, oh, we've got to refrag this thing too, like these topics don't matter anymore. I tend to think like we should preserve history and all ideas and what we can. So
but wouldn't it phase out naturally first, just through society? Like starting a fire, for example. Like we learned how to start fire, and it was an important initial technological tool that we had. Then at some point we had lighters, then electricity, and it's like I don't know, if you throw any average person out into the wilderness, I don't think they could start a fire.
They should. No, I mean, fire was also an early communication technology. It was super cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, look, I mean, only in like a doomsday prepper mentality of someone like myself, which I'm not like a prepper, but I think it's good for people to have basic survival skills, if only not because they'll need to use them, but if only just to like feel more connected to their humanity, and embodied in their humanity. But is it necessary? Like, have I ever needed to use one of the odd things personally that I know? Not really. But in a situation, and we all did experience situations, at least 2020, right, where we had like disruptions of basic order and supply chains, or the movement of food, or God forbid, toilet paper. Like, what are you going to do? Go get some leaves? Like, I think, yeah, people are not using those technologies, but it's help. I think there's a reason there are certain things that have been retained, like maybe the most primitive or basic things stick around throughout various civilizations, because they are the like foundational building blocks for the other things. So if like things were to break down or not work, or again, I ask, with like all of this information we're discussing that needs to be processed with information systems, which the way that they are right now for they're computing is still a very sort of manual. It's not a living thing, and it's something that relies on semiconductors, so a supply chain of microchips and microprocessors that come from somewhere, that come from precious metals and minerals that we do need, that there is a limit on. So there's probably a limit of what we can do there. And what if something were to be disrupted there, or electricity as we know it fails to function on these? So I think of then what's next for storing this information, which moves into more debates of like, what is the computing of the future? Mm-hmm. And someone brought this up on Twitter and sent an article which was about wetware computing. So basically growing human cells to create a neural network to put the internet basically on cultivated tissue from human cells. And this again, for me, was one of those like, oh no, kind of debates, not in a way of don't do it or do it. It's more of like, it's the likely direction of what will be powering a lot of what we're discussing. But also it does make you think. So if the internet and this computer or this phone is like on some sort of non-sentient microchip that's made of like cobalt and silicon and all of these things, which at least people think are not alive, but then it's like, oh, this is human brain cells and stem cells taken from, who knows what. Mm-hmm. then I start to ask questions about these things too, and what that looks like, and what is the timeline for it. I don't know. But have you gotten into any of this stuff, this wetware computing, or what's called synthetic biological intelligence?
I think a little. It makes me think a lot of, I don't know why, but it makes me think a lot of 3D printing, because everything I see on my phone these days is like completely synthetically made. It's like they have these 3D printers now that can use completely reusable material. It's like we're gonna have a world made out of plastic. And they're building houses now. It's crazy. Like they have these giant printers like printing cement houses, and they just stand there and just wait to hold the electrical cords. I mean, eventually you'll just have, robots doing half of that, probably Tesla's Optimus robot while they're building the houses. I don't know. It feels like the world is getting more synthetic, whether it's robots, whether it's 3D printing, whether it's AI. It's like everything is like this constantly being outsourced. And I look at it every day on my phone, just continuously pops up. I just throw it up on Instagram because I'm just like, I keep finding shit. And I'm like, is this good? Or is this, a little bit of a hint towards our demise and we're just phasing ourselves out? Like, it really does feel like we're an AI click away from Skynet sometimes. I'm not saying that that's our likely future that will happen, but it's like you look around you, everything is either automated, connected through IoT, connected through the internet. I mean, there are things that are sharing your data and sharing information you wouldn't even suspect are doing that. Cameras, laser detection systems, frequencies, 5G, like everything around you is like completely interconnected. And then you add in synthetics, then you add in robotics, then you add in your phone, which we probably hold to our face half the time during the day. And I don't know, one's got to wonder sometimes. Like, I think we're already there.
I think there's a split of this synthetic versus biological or organic debate, which is where we get into this like really crazy ethical gray area, because you're talking about manipulating human body or human biology or biology of our Earth ecosystems. And so I just shared a link because you were talking about like 3D printed concrete homes. Mm-hmm. This is an article about NASA prototyping fungal bricks. So mycelium is kind of the network, right, that makes up 95% of actually the communication network on this planet for trees and plants, but it's mushrooms essentially. And so these mushroom bricks are a lot. It's okay. There are a few different examples of commercial real estate companies and artists coming together to create installations to show this in form. There was one in the Netherlands, if I recall, that was up for a few years. Of course, it would be in the Netherlands, and I think in New York even too. And that's just crazy, right? Because if you like build a home that's made out of mushrooms, you're like in fairyland. But it makes you think about like something that is more natural and connected with the environment, and not in some sort of like hippy dippy way where it's not technologically like progressive, but in a way that's actually using these technologies. And I've seen a lot of examples. You mentioned 3D printing of actually 3D printing of bio or organic materials, some pretty nasty things as well in the food space, like a keg that cultivates like hamburgers in your own house out of like cultured meat. Like you grow it yourself inside your kitchen, and then it like prints out a hamburger. Mm-hmm. I was just having crazy ideas to help this company think of terrible things for the future. And
I don't think about that and salivate on a daily basis. I've also seen them make burgers out of insects, burgers out of flies. I'm like, it's disgusting. Like, I don't know. Maybe that is the future, but it's
not the future I want to live in.
I'm not eating bugs. I'm sorry.
That organization that I will not mention, but we've now shared, when I was in like the deep futurism world, and I'm not anti-tech or pro-tech, but there's definitely advocates now that I've learned more about the industry that I'm part of that are like, of course, like don't stop and ask questions. It's not appropriate to say, should we build this or not? The goal is just do it. And the insect thing was funny because I had found myself at a number of very, very fancy fundraiser type dinners with heads of state and what have you. And they're bringing out, the white glove service, and it's a tasting menu and wine pairing and everything on the menu. It was called Food of the Future. And it was fancy. It was like, but it all had vegan. It said vegan because in the future, apparently we're all vegan. And the ingredients listed, it was like vegan foie gras from mealworm something, and which is disgusting in general. All of it was just foul, and I didn't eat anything. I was taking pictures of it the whole time just so that I had documentation that I actually experienced this. But it was like bizarre to me that people were trying to make this like acceptable, that this is the future food, but also it was really depressing. Like there was an example of coffee and synthetic coffee beans that were cultivated in a lab. The reason was that they're like, well, climate change is so bad that we can't grow coffee beans in, Guatemala or where you are in Colombia. It's going to destroy the entire economy. So we're just going to build a startup that cultivates them in a lab and taste this coffee of the future. And I was like, this is like the worst. First of all, it tastes disgusting. Second of all, like there's no thought about, actually trying to fix the problem of the ecosystem, and not necessarily in like, again, an old school environmentalist way, but like in a way of every solution doesn't need to be to like grow something in a lab. Or another example of this is like the wine market with a lot of diseases. And of course, like the changing microclimates, not being able to produce grapes in some of these places. So, I found it kind of depressing in the sense that like I would love to find ways to better produce organic stuff, whether that's humans or food, in using technology to augment these natural systems, whether that's like augment agriculture and push us back to more of like a permaculture ideology as opposed to like a monoculture. So this big like factory farming, grow only soybean and destroy the land for quite some time. I think there are some approaches there.
Yeah, I think there is a future where maybe some of that could be necessary, and I don't think that's here on Earth. Maybe out there in the universe, maybe if we're trying to go interplanetary, maybe we can discuss that. But I think it's very pointless here to even be pursuing those things on Earth. Like, I don't even see the point in doing it unless you are trying to kill people. Like, it's not healthy. Like, you were here in Colombia briefly. Like, did you feel the difference when you had something to eat down here, or you drank, I don't know if you had a cup of coffee, and then you go back to the US? Like, it is a very discernible difference. And like, I live here, so it's very clear to me when I go back, but the food is so much different. The way that they procure it and sell it, and what they choose not to put into it, and what they choose not to inject their animals with, and the practices, the hormones, the MSG, the growth factors, like it's non-present. And I feel like it's just so unnecessary in the US. You go back to the US and it's like, I can't even, bend a banana in half. It won't break. Here it crumbles. But honestly, I feel healthier here, like a million times healthier than when I go back to the US and I have like a piece of meat, or I try to eat an apple. Like, I feel disgusting. Like, you can start to taste it on the food.
It's filled with arsenic. That's why. Like that apple. But yeah, I've heard this from people who live abroad, and even Europeans, that they like gain 10 pounds of inflammation in coming to the US. I've spent quite a bit of time outside of the US, but I did notice when I was in Latin America, in a few different countries for extended periods of time. Most recently after Colombia was Ecuador. And I was on a property in like a cloud forest, one of the only 3 remaining in the world, with drinking spring water and eating literally like drinking coconuts from the tree and like, picking my own bananas and all this stuff. But even the local food, everything. So within 18 days, I had started to go through basically a heavy metal detox. I had no idea what was happening other than my body. It was so clean. It was too clean of food that my body was like, and I'm a very like clean eater here, not in an obsessive way, just it's sort of what I gravitate towards, but it's very difficult in the US where I am right now to do this. And even if you source directly from, you know, farmers market or directly from the source, there's still challenges. So yeah, I feel badly for a lot of people and what I see them consuming, especially when they're trying their best to eat well or to feed their families well. And it's like, I don't want to be like, it's an uphill, you're doing it all wrong and it's an uphill, no matter what you do, it'll be, you won't do it right. But certainly there's like a bigger challenge in a number of countries that, that particularly this one with the food system.
It's an affordability aspect too. Like, I don't blame like a lot of Americans, because when you go to the grocery store and you're already constrained by your life, and everyone has a different life, and the economy, and you know what you're able to do. Maybe you have family, you have kids, maybe you have pets, you know, maybe you have medical expenses, you know, there's all kinds of different things. America's a very expensive place to live. And then you go to the store and you have eggs that are, you know, $3 a dozen, but there's also eggs
11
that are $8,
okay.
$9, $11 a dozen.
Yeah.
Why is it that the more expensive ones are always the healthier ones? It's like they put all this extra stuff into engineering all this food, and that is the cheapest food that you can get. But if you just want an apple right off the tree, they charge you more for it. And I get there's a large population in the US, but I really truly don't buy it, given how many people do live in Colombia. And this is just my unique perspective, and how much food is produced. It's almost like they underproduce for the sake of profit. Not like any corporation has never done that before. And I unfortunately think for a lot of people, that's just a way of life. You can't afford the more expensive eggs. And on top of it, when the cheaper eggs become more expensive, that's just doubly worse. But generally, the unhealthy stuff is the cheapest stuff. That's why people still go to McDonald's. That's why they're in business. That's why people opt for the less healthier options, because that's what they can economically afford. It's not always their fault, but it sucks that that's the optionality that you get.
Yeah. And you know, again, you see these bigger decisions that are made, or the points in history, fairly recent points in history, where things change, and like all of these chemicals ended up in the food system, in the difference of people's health and wellness before and after that period of time. And, you know, where we are now in the US with some, you know, I can't like rattle off statistics off the top of my head about the population that has diabetes or heart disease or is overweight, and honestly struggling with it in a way that it's like can't seem to shake it, because no matter how much you work out, if you're eating this crap food, it's not really going to make a difference. And then, you know, of course, magic advancements in pharmaceutical interventions like Ozempic, where you're basically like
I have nothing to do with that, I promise.
shooting yourself up with like cocaine. You know, I think it just goes to show how broken the system is. And it's something that in the past, honestly, even 10 years ago, if you were to critique it, because again, earlier in my career, I was and still continue to be in rooms with some of these organizations or trade associations. And like you'd like probably risk your life if you looked them straight in the eye and said like, you're effed up. Now I do tend to think that it's like the cat's out of the bag for a lot of things. People are doing their own research. They have access to an abundance of information on the internet and beyond. And I do think that some of the companies are, making honest efforts to rectify the situation. but if only just because from a capitalistic mindset, it's what they have to do. And I think others are probably going to continue to take this path that is pushing us more in a direction that is like this synthetic reality. And, even now, you've mentioned like some of the food feels different. And I know there are like viral things that go around the internet of the seedless watermelon and people like bending it and it's not watermelon. So there are conspiracies of like, it's the fake food. I've definitely seen and actually been in some of the labs where like the things like lettuce are cultivated from cells and wrapped up to look like lettuce.
Golden lettuce, like we saw last
Not
time.
the golden lettuce. This is different. This is literally just like culturing a vat of stuff and putting it together and being like, lettuce. It's a little iceberg lettuce that grew nowhere. And no one would know this, right, at the store. And no one really like reads the labels or the codes on the labels or tracking it. And I think that's why they're, again, in a past life, I had a company that was working on supply chain transparency and like securing global trade. Many of the companies didn't want transparent supply chains. They were like, oh, good idea. Nope. And I think there's a level of opacity that we've had in society that like upholds these systems, and threatening that by asking questions of like, where did this come from is something that, is becoming more acceptable now. And again, I think people are, of course, like they're entitled to their own health and happiness and to be aware of what they're putting in their own bodies. I think it's absurd that, at least in the United States right now, it's easier to access hormones and Ozempic than it is to access, let's say, like eggs for less than $10, just to use that example. There's something fundamentally flawed there. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is I wouldn't call it an evolutionary split, but there's certainly a split between the people who have access, whether that's like because of a socioeconomic status or, an intellectual status of an awareness around this stuff, that are choosing to live differently, probably more connected to an organic. By organic, I just mean like living earth-based lifestyle, wanting to live outside of urban environments, as opposed to another subset of the world that actually, I think, what is it? It's like 70% of the world. It's actually like quite a really high number that lives in an urban, like a city. Mm-hmm. And that number is going up year over year to the point.
It's conveniency. It's easier to live in a city. 2 hour Amazon shipping and internet at your fingertips everywhere you go, and Wi-Fi information. Everyone goes to cities. People don't go to rural areas anymore. If you want to see a concert or you want to go to your favorite hockey game, or like everything is centralized into these huge urban hubs. You can see that. You look on a map. If you ever look at like a video of Earth at night from the ISS, all the lights are congregated in very small zones. Like obviously there's lights scattered across countries. Like you look at the US, like there's lights here and there, but for the most part, most of the light comes from these major cities. That's because that's where everyone is located. And I don't think that's healthy.
I'm looking for like millions of links now for you of examples. So there's this concept of the 15-minute city, and I'm going to share the first example was in Oxford, England. And it's really this framework. And this is the line in Saudi Arabia, which is aiming to be, again, like a large city in the desert that essentially repeats itself in a pattern. So anything that you might need, whether that's like your family, your kid's school, the pharmacy, the grocery store, is like a park is all within a 5-minute walk or 15-minute walk, and then it repeats, and it just does it over and over again for hundreds of miles.
I'm anti-line. Yeah. I don't think it's going to work.
Good. Reasons. So, and then in England, there's the concept of, again, the 15-minute city, which was kind of creating districts, right, in this city, and restricting people's movements to certain districts. I think in New York City, they're starting to tax people using an approach, a carbon tax, essentially, of like cars emission to prevent movement. There's another city in, I think, Mesa, Arizona, that is a planned intentional community as well that doesn't allow cars. So those are a few examples. And I share this. So there's a lot of conspiracy around the 15-minute city concept because, you know, when you put people in a area where they don't have to leave a 15-minute walking radius and they're not allowed to have a car, or they must share cars, the fears around sort of like communism, socialism, or just like some oppressive authoritarian regime coming in and saying you don't have your vaccine passport, therefore you can't leave, you know, or you said something bad on Twitter, you can't buy groceries with your central bank digital currency that we're tracking. So that's the conspiracy side. I think conspiracies aside, I mean, there is definitely a macro trend in terms of urban planning and commercial real estate on a global scale that is moving towards urbanization. And this is an overall trend or agenda that, again, it's some crazy number. Like the majority of the world's population will be in urban areas by 2050. That inherently is a synthetic environment. So yes, you listed all like the fun bread and circuses, novelty items of why you would be there. Like I'm in a city right now. I hate it. I call it like when I have to be here, I'm like, oh my God, I'm like doing my mission. I understand there is definitely convenience for certain things and it's required for certain activities. But, you know, in terms of supporting aspects of what we've just discussed of a more connected lifestyle, I think the true privilege are those that will be able to live in areas that are a little more disconnected or rural, or able to produce their own food and at least know where it's sourced, or create local community farmers markets or things like this where you have that face-to-face trust. I'm not saying we won't fix these systems, but there will be a period of time where, you know, we'll have to see it shake out. And then meanwhile, you know, we have also on our debate of will people start to evolve differently when we become interplanetary, and, you know, there's people up in space and there's people on Mars, which is a whole, you know, that's a totally different debate of, you know, they like go out there and what happens to the rest of us down here? We become like two totally different species. Do the city people become a different species of Homo sapien than the rural people? Like, you know, think about that. I'm not saying over the span of like 1 or 2 or 5 generations, but what if that's like 100 generations? What if they're like these bands of people that are living connected to what's left of, you know, the clean organic environments, and the others that are going into the synthetic ones? Does that change? Right.
I think living on Mars for the first, let's say 20 or 30 years is going to be hell. I don't think it's going to be fun. I think it's going to take a very strong-willed group of people, very brave and strong-willed, to push through that. You know, I think living on Earth, you know, if you were to go to Mars and try and ride it out for a year and then come back to Earth, I think you'd feel so grateful that Earth exists for many reasons. And maybe this is where some of these synthetic outsourced technologies might actually come in very helpful on Mars, even synthetic foods, because there's going to be a demand and a need for those things. And I think it's going to be very hard for us to avoid. I don't know how we're going to get chickens and cows and pigs and build sustainable environments very quickly on Mars. I'm not saying it's impossible, but, you know, we need a diverse diet. We need to be able to sustain ourselves. We need water. We need shelter. We need the right atmospheric pressure. Gravity is going to be a hard adjustment, UV radiation, temperature fluctuations. There's a lot of things that I think will be a significant challenge to that. And I think by the time we figure it out, we will definitely look very different, because I don't think there's a way where we can just live in a bubble on Mars for the next couple hundred years. I think it might work in the short term, but I think people will just go insane. Like, you need to be able to have this feeling of like what people had when they first arrived to the Americas. And there's this feeling of manifest destiny and being American. I don't necessarily agree with it 100%, but it was something that drove people to go find land, to go find opportunity, to build something. And that built modern America. That led to industrialization and some of the most important advancements we've ever had in human history. You kind of need that pioneering feel, I think, if you're going to go to Mars. And I don't think we can just have lunar hab after hab after hab, like for hundreds of miles across Mars. I do think we need to find a way to transform the environment, or ourselves to match the environment over time, to really get the most out of it, or else we're really heavily relying on technology, right? We'll have to send out robots and rovers and AI to enlist for mining deposits and building out these structures. There's almost only so much we can do in a spacesuit. I think it is going to be very tricky.
Yeah, I mean, so if these people want to, like biohackers, basically want to create their little avatar, like the movie Avatar, that's like, supposed to be living on that planet, and kind of just like put their consciousness in a different body, we get into, again, this like biohybrid robot. So when we think of robots, I think like the first thought that comes to mind for many people, I know for myself, is like, a robot made out of synthetic materials, like, again, plastic or metal or titanium, something that we might have seen in the movies, whether it is Star Wars and C-3PO and R2-D2, or it's the Terminator, or any of those things. But I don't think there is so much, like, I really think the way that robotics will go is what's called biohybrid. So a hybrid of, again, biological material and synthetic material. Biological meaning like growing this, and powering, instead of a computer chip, it's got like a wetware, a brain computer chip. And I think that's probably, again, ethics aside, because this is an area that is so insanely crazy to me, of an ethical gray zone. And these types of experiments, whether it's human cloning that has been quite secretive for many years, or even like not happening, wink wink, but there have been certainly public animal clones, like Dolly the sheep, and I think there are even services like companies that will clone your dog for you. I think that's probably like the likely thing. We could be building vehicles, we could be terraforming, so changing the environment of Mars, or let's say changing the environment of Earth through weather modification, which we're already doing, right? Whether that's a response to, if the belief is that there's global warming, that we need to augment things, or in the case of, let's say, Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. I was there last year, and it's crazy. It's a city that was built, starting in the 70s? It was like a patch of desert. And in addition to building an entire city, they use cloud seeding to make it rain. This is, again, a concept that would have been like a crazy conspiracy theory. Like, it still is, but yet it's like right there. We're like, oh yeah, that's what we're doing here. So again, there's this idea of changing the environment, or creating structures or greenhouses or things here or on Mars to preserve humanity here, if the belief is that like Earth is going to kick us out or die. I don't think Earth will die. I think Earth will decide to be not habitable for us. But like, I think yeah, it's an interesting concept of changing the body or growing a different body that could be more, that is better suited for an environment, which also brings the questions for me here. If we can do it with under the auspices of, hey, we're growing like a Mars person. This person will be able to handle this gravitational environment. This person, this thing, whatever the name that it does not yet have, will be able to breathe on what is the composition of the atmosphere on Mars. Like maybe it has different lungs. And then the question is, if we can do that there, are we doing it here? Are people doing that? Like, will they start growing different types of people here? So
have you seen the Simpsons movie?
No.
Where they deem Springfield a dangerous zone for whatever reason. It's been a long time. And then the president decides to put a dome over the city, over the town, to encapsulate all the people. And it was really funny because at first it's like, fine, we're in a dome, whatever. And then after weeks start going by, they're like, it's setting in day 50 in the dome. We've ran out of everything from coffee to Botox. And then the people start losing their minds. Like, we can only run from one side of the dome to the other so many times. We're running out of things to do. It's silly. It's funny, but I do think that there's a little bit of truth in some of that. If we're in a dome on Mars, yes, it's doable, but for a society, like a normal average person, not someone that's been preparing their whole life to go to Mars and that isn't like, this, well-prepped astronaut or space explorer, like a normal person, like, I don't think that they're going to handle that very well mentally. I really do think there has to be a way for us to go beyond the dome idea and actually be able to live there. And so, it's probably one of three things. We either terraform Mars, and there's a lot of ideas about how to do that, but it'll take time. 2, we augment ourselves, which I think will just be very complicated, very expensive, and maybe impractical to a degree. Or 3rd, which I think is most logical and is what we saw in Avatar, is to have some type of synthetic body that maybe we can just transmute our mind into. And if we can do that with Neuralink to play a video game, I don't think we're far off from being able to control another synthetic being that maybe we create. I think that that's a real possibility as well. If we're talking about how do we evolve ourselves so that we can interact with those environments.
That is the craziest part. First of all, I think the people that are going to Mars are the Burning Man people. It's the same group. It's like, they're well prepared to be out in a desert and run out of drugs or whatever else they're doing. They'll be fine. But I don't remember, like, in a number of these movies, what happens if you disconnect, or like if your synthetic body dies, do you die or come out of the dream? It's kind of like Inception as well with these dream states. In that, you're basically just, it's a remote controlled avatar. And that to me seems not only probable, but like something, I wouldn't say possible today, but we'll probably see this in the news in like 2 weeks from Neuralink. I would not be surprised if you can control a cursor on a screen that someone hasn't in the lab hooked up some sort of like Raspberry Pi that moves like a car on the ground. Like, I would do that to myself in 5 minutes if I had one of these things in my head. Like, for sure you can do this. The question is like, the question of like a soul or consciousness or these discussions, right? Because remotely controlling something else, you're still here, presumably, or alive, whether you're in some matrix like pod being like fed and nourished while you're living this other double life. But it seems like you still need this body to be living for that one to be living. I suppose like the real advancement there that would be in, crazy next step is if you don't come back, if like you're able to kind of upload to this avatar, whether it's in a digital realm, whether it's in an interdimensional realm, whether it's a physical realm on another planet. It's sort of like teleportation in some respect. But yeah, I mean, I think to your point, we'll probably be remote controlling avatars soon. I know I've shown a few examples of that in real practice recently in a few events of just like something as simple as doing repairs on a space station. Instead of sending another human up there to do a spacewalk, we could have humanoid robots that are like out floating, because sometimes it's easier for a person, right, to like immerse themselves in another human form to, you know, tighten a screw. So I think we'll probably start to see some of this that's more like a humanoid rover of sorts that like people plug into. But then do you lose it? Do you like forget who you are? Do you get so addicted to being plugged into like Mars version that you want to stay in the video game? And what does that do for not just your psychological well-being, but again, over time, over many generations, do people, to the point of this discussion, an episode, evolve differently?
I was always told by my neuro professor when I was in college, and I regarded him as one of the smartest people I've ever met. He used to tell us that the human brain is the last frontier of human biology. And it made a lot of sense, because when we think about the body, what do we have the most questions about, and what do we understand the least? And what is constantly changing and reframing what we thought was set in stone, and that's the human brain. And further than that, the human mind and how that actually works. And I don't want to infringe upon someone's religion or spirituality. Like, this can get really touchy for a lot of people. Talk about, the self and the soul, and, who you are as a being, and what happens when you make those leaps. I don't know the answer. I don't think anyone truly does. Definitely people have experimented with it. The Soviets are very famous for this stuff too. Supposedly they were taking, head off Bob A and putting it on body of Bob 2, and, interesting things were happening, but wasn't connecting. So
What?
I don't want to paint that whole picture. But there's a lot of questionable things I think we've done in the pursuit of science. But I don't know how to answer that. All I know is that it is possible for us to use our minds to do things externally. And I think the science supports it. I just don't know, like, from a consciousness standpoint, if we can do that or not. I personally think it's possible. But again, if I have my little blue avatar running around on Mars and I'm jumping around and playing in the dirt, and then a meteor knocks me out and kills me, like, do I just disconnect and go back to my body, or am I now dead because my consciousness was there and not present? And then my body's just in a comatose state and is an empty shell. Like, I don't know. It's a very good question. I think of it like a video game.
It is. Yeah.
If you're playing a video game, like, you play Mario, like, Mario dies, but you're fine. Like, you can reset and replay the game and keep going. But, like, is consciousness like, your state within the game? And if you lose, that state is gone? Or is consciousness like you externally controlling the game?
That's funny you say that. The first chapter in my book is consciousness, about Super Mario Brothers. Yes, same page. We must be connected. I used it more of like, you like, really, when you start playing the game is when you're also like trying to find the secret levels and playing it backwards and doing stuff. So it's like not only awareness that you're an avatar in the game, it's not only awareness that you're the player controlling an avatar in the game, but it's saying who's controlling the player. It's, turtles all the way down. I don't know. I mean, again, there's so many religious, spiritual, philosophical, scientific traditions that seek to explain. This is kind of the biggest mystery, right? The existential questioning. And I think it's probably one of the biggest drivers of human inquiry for anything. Since the dawn of time, once we had an awareness of awareness itself, And once we had awareness that there's life and death, I think it drives a lot of scientific progress as well. You know, even like people who are like deep into quantum physics right now, like, yes, because you're just trying to figure out like the meaning of the universe and what happens when you're here or you're not here. Could we be here? Could we be in multiple places at once, like superimposed or quantum entangled? What happens, as you mentioned, if one of those is eliminated, you know? And I have a hunch, like, again, I don't have, like, I'm sitting here doing the research myself, that these types of questions, whether we're talking about evolution, we're talking about people controlling biohybrid robots on Mars, are bringing up these, again, as we started the episode, existential questions about what it means to be a human. What does it mean to be alive or not alive? What does it mean to be a man or a woman, or something else that is not named? And they're contentious, right? They're like really existential questions that make you, like, to your core feel something. That's why they're so powerful. But, you know, the video game thing, I think it's a very provocative idea, because you can imply that you're just you play and try again.
It's not too far out there, because if you think of it like as a play state, and you build this character and you do things with this character and you make progress with this character, and it's existing over a period of time, you know, that existence, if it, you know, you fail, you die, you know, game over. You know, you're Mario and you hit the turtle and he falls off the cliff and you have to start over, you run out of lives. Like, is that state itself is gone, but are you part of that state? Like, is it you disconnect and you forget everything that happened during the 3 hours you're running around in your avatar? Or are you stuck in that state and now your consciousness is gone? I don't know. I feel like there's an interesting rabbit hole to go down there that I think we'll eventually find out if it's true or not. But I don't know. It's a whole different conversation.
I bring this up. We should do a topic on this sometime. It's sort of biohacking, right? But more in the cognitive side of things. That I saw there was, you know, every so often certain things trend on the internet, or certain narratives go around, particularly on X or Twitter. Today there was quite a bit around psychedelics, and specifically ayahuasca. And you know, this being a certain chemical, you're frozen for a second, but I can keep going. DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine, the chemical that is, you know, constantly produced in our bodies, released when we dream, released when we're born or giving birth or dying. In some, you know, you would know more than I do from a neuroscience perspective or a chemical perspective, but, you know, there's some theories that even suggest it's what's rendering our perception of this reality, like taking the pictures coming from all these senses. So the reason I bring it up, their Imperial College in London it has been doing what's called extended state DMT research. So this is normally a chemical that people will ingest, like either smoke or drink it in these retreats, right? And it's a shorter experience, but extended state, they're doing research on people through an intravenous drip, so that people are held in this state longer. And they are coming back, you know, after hours, which feels like lifetimes to them, reporting that they've lived an entirely separate life. So, you know, there's a guy, from my understanding, this is anecdotal, who like literally had a whole life, was born, went to school, got married, had children, was divorced, like got married again. Like it was a whole thing, and then passed away, and then like wakes up in this hospital bed and is like, where the hell am I? And confused. He wanted to go back to this other life, but he had forgotten that he had come and was doing this research. But from him, the perception of time was that it was a full lifetime. So I think, you know, I'm not advocating, by the way, for people to go do this, though. Like, you know, everyone, if it's legal where you are, whatever, everyone has the right to do with their body as they please. In this case, this person's medical research, but like that brings up huge questions about the nature of this game you're describing, of these different avatars in this case. Like, was that real? Was that just a fabrication of his mind, a very long dream, or did he like go to a different dimension and have a different lifetime? And are there secrets to this, whether it's through chemical portals that could kind of be instrumental in people's gateways to, let's say, powering these other entities? Almost sounds like demonic possession now that I'm describing this. I'm like, how do people like enter another body and control it without their knowledge? It's this stuff. This is why it's so provocative, because I don't think this is the first time in human history that these concepts have been explored or discussed. I think that's why there's so many ancient texts, religious texts, philosophical texts that if you really read them and read between the lines, like I really don't believe this is the first time in human history that humans have reached this level of, let's say, philosophical or scientific awareness. This is not to say that like we had this form of civilization or these forms of like computers and I don't know what's something absurd like Uber. I don't think Uber was around, but I do think that some of these topics, we were probably like 1,000 years ago doing some crazy stuff with different approaches and different technologies. And, if you look at certain, again, like religious, philosophical, literature, art, there are themes. And this, hearing myself say this, like this is clearly a theme.
I want to touch on this, and then we'll have to wrap it up for tonight because I'll have to jump off. But it's interesting in neuroscience, like there's two ways to look at it when you look at things like LSD, drugs, ayahuasca, hallucinogens in particular are really fascinating. But you can look at it from a behavioral aspect, and you can measure that, and you can say, okay, this person takes a drug and they get really hyper, they think that they're superhuman, they feel maybe that they're going crazy, or they feel lethargic, or maybe they feel hungry, or maybe they get schizophrenic, or maybe they get tons of energy. There's all these different things you can observe and test, and that really forms a baseline for what these drugs can do. And then you can look at it from a psychological standpoint, and you can measure that through imaging. You look at the effects of cocaine on the brain, and you can see a lot of the activities localized in certain parts of the brain. You look at marijuana, a lot of that lights up certain areas of the brain. You look at any hallucinogen, especially something like ayahuasca or LSD or even mushrooms, and it's very different in the fact that the entire brain looks like it's lighting up like a Christmas tree. And it's like it's flashing here and flashing here and flashing there, but it's almost like the whole brain is on fire. And that's usually how they describe it. And it's really hard to know if we're creating a disillusioned idea of what's going on because the brain doesn't know what's going on, or if there's something actually happening there because the brain is operating at such a high capacity. And that I don't know if we'll be able to figure out for a very long time. I mean, maybe sooner than we think because of technology, but there's no answer to it. It's just very fascinating that when you have the brain pushed to such a capacity and you have it firing on all cylinders like that to the point where it looks like a Christmas tree, there's no real answer to whether or not people really are seeing the aliens on DMT, or if they're traveling through universes and have a huge religious experience through ayahuasca, or if they get to hold hands with God and maybe it heals something for them. Like I've heard a million awesome stories about it too, but I've also heard some of the terrible stories. And one has to wonder if it's also an effect of your environment or society or a preconceived notion going into it. Because we do know that a lot of ancient civilizations were using this stuff a long time ago, and they were also believing that if you chop a kid's head off and push him over a pyramid, that it'll make it rain tomorrow.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to say, you know, if it's having that kind of effect and it's something beyond the physical aspects, or if it is all physiological and we're creating a slight illusion based on what we believe going into it, or maybe something that just comes out of it and we take that as truth, we take that as fact. You know, again, there's no answer to it, but one does have to acknowledge that the brain is on fire when you take a hallucinogen. And so, you know, it's harder to measure when everything is a light bulb and it's not certain regions or certain things. It can be kind of discerned between one another. But nonetheless, it is fascinating.
I think these people back in the day were, you know, maybe their heads were on fire as well. And again, that's the question of, is it psychosis or is it something, you know, maybe they did believe they were talking to some sort of God, right? Or supernatural being that requested that it be fed by those heads they were chopping off, right? I think that's sort of where the belief system came from. And I think this would be a good topic for, right, another time. It still kind of bleeds into this topic because our perception and cognition is another frontier, especially through not just substances and psychedelic research or chemical interventions, but other activities and technologies and behaviors and research as well. I think something even as simple as the influence of the environment, so space design, lighting, sound, music, a lot of these things have been, you know, like finely tuned in our society for certain purposes. But it's, you know, there are also really cool advancements of even like using sound waves to target, I mean, basically this is like ultrasound, right, to target cancer cells and things like this. It's basically, can you cure cancer with music? And these notions of sound healing, which are all very like quite ancient technologies, like people making bells and stuff hundreds of years ago or more. And I think it's interesting that as we progress through different epochs of human civilization, or the ones that are just kind of like characterized throughout history, again, a lot of themes repeat themselves. A lot of approaches are still fundamentally the same. They're still kind of playing by the rules of like classical physics as well. But yeah, again, I think on that debate of like shifting the mind, it would be interesting to see if there's also additional research that the brain would react in a similar way to other things. Like I'm wondering if there are other activities or situations that are not chemically induced through a psychedelic that do that to the brain. I'm sure there are plenty ways of achieving that state as well. But yeah, for another day.
Yeah, I mean, in short, that is something that does happen. Probably not as to an extreme effect as if you're on a psychedelic, but we experience it all the time. We experience it with dopamine and euphoria and fear and anxiety. And it's a natural part of the body's evolution to help us survive and protect us. But in a modern society, it just becomes inflamed. It might be something that we actually need to evolve out of, because I don't think we need to have anxiety all the time. But you know, maybe there's an argument for certain things. But it's a reaction, a hormonal cocktail within our body that fluctuates. But you know, definitely with certain substances and under certain conditions is quite amplified. But I think it would be best served for another episode for sure. I do think we should dive into it more. I don't know if we did an episode talking about the mind or consciousness or talking about some of these effects. I think it'd be very fascinating too.
I agree. I think, you know, anything with the mind, consciousness, and certainly mind altering techniques is always a hit. And it's definitely an area of interest to me as well. And as it relates, again, more broadly to these questions of technology and futurism and the impacts on humanity. And really, you know, it's funny because like where we are right now, where we started this conversation of these, again, these fundamental existential and ethical questions about what it means to be a human, and like what should or shouldn't we do to our bodies within a society, or not just bodies, but our bodies, our mind, everything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I kind of feel like Western society is in this moment of like collective psychosis, or like I call it a collective ego death, because it's just literally like everything is so destabilizing and insane that the systems are breaking down. And this was like a long time coming, but now it's like you're really feeling it. Like we talked tonight about food systems. We're talking about knowledge ecosystems. Where is knowledge coming from? Who's control? Is it school? Am I doing math on my phone or not? The breakdown of the meaning of life, the breakdown of like what is an actual human. So it does sort of feel like we're collectively, our brains are firing on all cylinders here. I look forward to the day where maybe we kind of like reconstitute into something that's a bit more cohesive, you know, and a bit more understanding, because we're definitely in a period of, it's not like a dark age, but like we're breaking through to what feels like a golden age. There's like enlightenment on the other end, but we're sort of in the mess right now with like these really big questions, and there aren't really answers. There probably won't be. So we just ask more questions.
Absolutely. This has been a fantastic episode. We definitely covered a lot of topics, expanding upon, I think, evolution. And definitely looking forward to the next one. I don't know exactly what topic. Again, I think we kind of decide a couple days after each episode, after mulling it over, but would be fun to explore the mind a little bit more, I think, and dive into that. So maybe that'll be the next episode, a little quick sneak peek for people. But anyways, make sure to give the show a follow. If you're listening, watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe there. On socials, make sure to give us a follow, so you don't miss every episode that comes out weekly on Mondays. And yeah, it's been a great episode, Sam. Any last final thoughts before we wrap it up?
No, just have a good night, everyone, and sweet dreams in the Avatar dreamland of Super Mario Brothers.
Sounds good. See you guys all next week. Take care and have a good evening.